Hello, welcome to Author Hour. I'm your host, Richard Lyntton, author of North Korea Deception and Hyde Park Deception. But today I would like to welcome local author Douglas Richardson, now retired from earlier careers as an award-winning Dow Jones columnist, executive coach, federal prosecutor, mental health lawyer, and communications director for a sprawling government agency. Douglas now relishes his role as a full-time debut novelist. He is also the author of several non-fiction business books and lives locally with his wife Pam and their 3 delightfully assorted dogs. Douglas, hello.
Hi, how are you, Richard?
Welcome. How are you?
It is a pleasure to be here. It's exciting to be here.
Yeah, it's really great. Well, I always say I have no idea how I'm going to start the show or where we're going to go, but I think we should mention our mutual friend, Frioni Hingley. How do you know Frioni?
Well, it is Pam, my wife, who knows Frioni, and Frioni provided some services to Pam, and in the course of their chatting, and Pam reminds me that women always network better than men.
That's so true.
You know, she mentioned you, and the rest is history.
Well, that's great. And because then the reason I mention that is because Frioni is a friend from the Griffin Cafe, who I'm sure many of you know. I spent 10 years writing my 2 books in the Griffin. And Frioni is one of those people who is like gold dust for writers, right? She's supportive. She reads your book. She writes reviews. And I noticed that you, at the end of your book, are very complimentary and thankful and grateful for all your sort of network of friends and writers and helpers. Tell us a little bit about how, you know, your team, that you found all these people that you needed actually to help you along the way.
Well, I'm a loner by nature, so I was well along in the book. But, you know, like most first-time novelists, I was troubled by the idea, is this a real book? Is it credible? Will anybody find it interesting? So early on, I began pushing pieces of it off to people I knew, including a couple of professional editors. And I said, does this meet the sniff test and should I continue on? And I got feedback from them and it was valuable. And I began pushing it on to other people, got more feedback from them. And eventually I engaged a professional editor who was the fellow who edits John Jakes.
Okay.
And he's a merciless editor. And the combination of my friends and that professional help really changed the shape and the direction of the book. And it's just pure gold. So
how long did you, by the way, here is the book, Downwind and Out of Sight. Downwind and Out of Sight. Beautiful book, beautiful cover. And we're going to talk more about the book in a second. But how long did it take you to write?
Well, the punchline is 20 years.
Right.
But I only retired about 3 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And, you know, in the last year, I was consulting with my wife, Pam, and in our last year of consulting, we traveled 275,000 miles. So there wasn't a lot of time to sit at home and lay out a disciplined writing thing. But the book is basically constructed out of an assemblage of pieces that came out of my mental closet, so to speak. And I wrote the first piece of it probably 25 years ago, just to, you know, one section of it. And then, so it was a series of vignettes, and the whole challenge was, can these be brought together to be coherent, to create a book, and can be more than just sort of, you know,
so you retired
quilt.
3 years ago. So you're traveling, doing all this traveling. So are you writing on planes and in hotel rooms?
Nope. No, I'm stealing an hour here and an hour there. The book is set on northern Chesapeake Bay, and the reason for that is for a long time, we had a little cottage on the Bohemia River on northern Chesapeake Bay. So we would skulk down there on weekends, and I had some time to write then. And an idea would come to mind, and I would sit down and dash it off. But, you know, I have to tell you that I do not qualify as a disciplined writer who sets a certain number of hours aside each day or each week. But
so how much did you have sort of already written? You know, you say you wrote it over all those years, because I'm just like trying to get in my head here. So you didn't have that much time to write. So how on earth did you get this whole novel together? Because it's a big, long, intricate novel.
I just kept writing and time passed.
Okay.
And at the moment, after it was professionally edited, he said, listen, nobody will ever buy a manuscript of 150,000 words. You really have to bring it down by at least a third. 100 is sort of the practical cap. So we took out the chainsaw. And my problem Richard, is that writing is too much fun for me. Right. I simply love the act of writing itself, and that means that I have a tendency to go off on tangents or throw in too much detail. So that's where the discipline came in, actually, was in tightening the book up and paring it down rather than conceptualizing it at the beginning.
So, I mean, as always, I have tons and tons of questions because it's what some of your readers have called sort of a mind-bending genre. Let's start there. First of all, normally we don't talk about the book, but I do. Actually, I'm going to change questions. So at the beginning, I found the beginning so like gripping and like talk about pulling you in straight away.
Right.
I don't normally talk about the content of the book, but it's only the first chapter. So I think it's okay to talk about it. But so there's a dead body, and there's a detective, and there's the dead body is talking to his left notes for the detective.
Yes,
which is great. I just love that. And then there's a discovery of a journal. So it really makes you want to read the book and find out what on earth went on with this guy. Correct?
Yeah, the voice of the journal is the voice of the dead guy, who, by the way, is dead because he's committed suicide.
Okay.
So the book starts with a suicide, and you have to wonder, how can you run the book from there? And that was my practical challenge.
Now, did you just come up, because I call that a strategy, or I'm forgetting the word, but it's a way, a mechanism of writing your story, having that sort of pivotal journal idea. Did you just come up with that? Did you read other books that were like that? Did you see a movie?
That was actually the second attempt. In the first couple of drafts, I had an outside person, a retired FBI agent, who was going to be reading these journal entries and pulling them all together. And it made it very cumbersome, and he really didn't have anything to do. And what I realized it would work just as well is if I had this detective you described, who, by the way, is an unscrupulous person, read a journal that is going at some point to get him in big trouble. So it's a first-person voice, and the first-person voice is of one of the main characters in the book, who also starts the book by committing suicide.
And he's written this journal that you sort of follow as part of the book.
Exactly right.
Very, very, very clever. Very clever. I just want to say I love that. Right out. I can see it as a movie already. You said that writing is fun, and I don't want to give people the wrong impression, because you and I both know, because we've both written more than one book, that the fun part is, I always say, Doug, it's like 35% is the writing and 65% is the publishing, putting the book on Amazon, and marketing and selling the book.
Right.
I don't want people to think that it's all fun. How hard was it for you to get past the creative stage and then realize, oh my God, there's a lot more to do?
When I was writing, I thought that's all there was. I was just writing a book. And then I thought the future would sort of take care of itself. And I think I probably still had the old image that when you write a book, when you're done, you send out a bunch of query letters to a bunch of potential agents. You get a bunch of rejection letters. Eventually you get a hit. You hire an agent. They negotiate a contract with a publisher who does everything from there on. And I have learned the hard way, the very hard way, that's not the way it goes. So for me, the 35%, or in my case, the 12% of writing was where the fun is. But I'm blessed. And that is that my wife, Pam, is a very, very accomplished social media expert, publicist, and she has taken on the lion's share of doing publicity, outreach, book signings, and stuff like this. I didn't know how to do that. I would not have known how to do it, and I didn't even have enough sense to be afraid of what I've got myself into. And
she has a website called Literary Leadership.
Yes.
So it's www.literaryleadership.com, right?
Right.
So she helps other authors. Over 50, is it? Is that
over
is that
50? That's yes. We're trying to tap the geriatric market, because one of the things that is of interest to some people is for somebody to have the debut novel get published when you're 75. So I was sort of hoping to tap into the Grandma Moses myth of can old people actually write stuff that anybody else will read? And
What advice would you give to someone who has completed their manuscript, it's ready, it's been professionally edited? I'm glad you say that, because I always tell people you must spend your money on editing and book cover. But what would you tell someone who hasn't got that, partner who has got all that expertise on the publicity and social media?
Well, my advice would be careful. In the digital age, there are now hundreds of people who are online marketing fail-safe services to you. They say they'll handle everything, or they'll handle publicity, and they will lighten you up big time. So zipper your wallet shut and be very discerning in how you contract for professional services, whether it be editing, whether it be publicity, whether it be arranging tours, because it's a sucker's market. And I must say that if it weren't for Pam, I would have been hopelessly at sea. And I had enough sense when some people were pitching packages to me, whether it was they wanted to charge me $1,250 to write a press release, right. That sort of thing. Ridiculous. And so talk to people who've done it before. Mm-hmm. Talk to people who've learned the bitter lessons. Vet your people very carefully. Get references and referrals, because you can, if I had bought into an entire package that was pitched to me, I would have been out $22,500.
Oh, wow, that's great.
And
that's great.
Now, fortunately, Pam is worth $1 million, so she has really saved me, but I would not have been a discriminating buyer. So know what you don't know and go slow and do your research.
Doug, you've written a heck of a lot of nonfiction books and articles and things. How, two-part question, how did that help you writing a novel, fictional novel, and what was the difference between writing nonfiction and fiction?
For me, it's a very fundamental difference, particularly given the nature of what I was writing. The business books that I wrote fall under the category of service journalism. They teach people how to do things, whether it's teaching lawyers how to write briefs or teaching job seekers how to interview and stuff. So they all came from the point of view of me being the expert and telling somebody how to do things. So it was didactic, it was instructive, it had to be logical, it had to be well laid out. It wasn't particularly imaginative because it was basically how-to stuff. And the discipline of going through law school helped in that because, everything in all legal writing involves you start with the punchline, the court should affirm the decision, and then you back and fill logically and rationally. Fiction writing is just wonderfully and completely different. At least for me it is. It's much more akin to the idea of painting. Mm-hmm. And instead of taking a snapshot and sticking it up on the wall and saying, here it is, and this is an immutable form, you get into things and a picture comes to mind. And I had never had the luxury of just letting my mind sort of drift and do paint pictures and experiment with various kinds of lies and deceptions and distortions. It's entirely different.
So when you write, or let's just talk about Downwind and Out of Sight for a second, the first book. So I know you had all these bits and pieces, but did you have did you have an outline? Did you have a chapter outline? How did you actually put it all together to make, a book?
It evolved. I must say, the fun of it was certain characters changed dramatically, but they took on a life of their own, and that dictated a lot of the tempo of the action and the nature of the action. Yeah. If I have a cardinal sin, it's that I go too heavily on dialogue, and this book is supposed to be a genre bender, but it's a thriller.
What do you mean by that, by the way, the genre bender? I wasn't quite. I wanted to ask you what you meant by that, or what someone who read your book said it's a genre bender.
Well, the book has now been nominated for some literary awards under sort of the customary categories. It's a thriller. Yep. It's a suspense thriller. It's a first book suspense thriller. So it's a book that has a lot of action, and it engages the lawyer, not just with action, but action unlike anything they've ever heard before. So it has a surprise factor. But it also has a very distinct subtext to it, and that is the lives of some very seriously damaged and isolated people and how they relate to each other and how they handle the terrific problems they cope with. So on one hand, it's an action book. On the other hand, it has it's an attempt at a compassionate view of people who are really struggling. And when I did try to contact some agents early on, and whatever reaction I got back saying, it sounds like you're throwing a lot of stuff into a blender. And so the idea is, how do you have these different aspects, the thriller aspect, the mystery aspect, the police procedural aspect, because I was a prosecutor. There's a lot in this book about autism. One of the main characters is profoundly autistic in a very unique way. And I've long been interested in that. So somebody could say, well, it's a book about autism.
Do you know someone who's autistic?
Oh, I know a lot of people who are autistic. I used to coach them.
Oh, interesting.
And so a lot of my executive coaching dealt with people who were brilliant but had self-limiting behaviors. So that's an area I know well. Fantastic. Do I know police investigations? Yeah, I know how they work. The part about a whale finding its way up Chesapeake Bay, I'll admit that was not first-hand knowledge.
What about the mental health area?
Part of my career is after I was a prosecutor, and I learned the hard way that I'm intensely averse to conflict, and I had chosen a bad way to make a living. I became the legal counsel for all the mental hospitals and mental retardation centers in Pennsylvania. So I was a mental health lawyer, and I was not practicing psychiatry or psychology, but I learned a lot about it, and I did a rotation in psychiatry at Penn Medical School. So I certainly got conversant with a lot of the issues and a lot of the problems that are in the mental health sector.
And you also, I noticed, you said at one point, you had experienced the pernicious face of rural racism. Can you give us an example? I am curious about that, especially nowadays. It's sort of all, I feel like it's all coming back. This racism thing, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's here in this country, shootings, whatever. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Well, we're certainly seeing a lot of the face of urban racism. And, we have demonstrations and we have riots and we have confrontations between scores of police and scores. In northern Maryland, on northern Chesapeake Bay, things are a lot quieter. But there are still a lot of unspoken rules about the way the races relate. It's not at all unusual in Elkton, Maryland, for example, to see a person of color walking down the street, and if a white person comes toward them, they'll cross the street and walk to the other side. And the attitudes toward them are still sort of straight back into 200 years of oppression, and only in quieter, more modest numbers. I'll give you one quick example in this book. There's an example of a white state policeman who wants to create problems for the black protagonist. So what he does is he pulls him over on the highway and he walks by his car and he slams his taillight with his baton and he shatters the taillight, and then he arrests him for not being compliant with the motor vehicle code, sticks him in a jail cell overnight, never charges him, never books him, never gives him a phone call, and the next morning lets him go and says, have you learned anything? This is the sort of thing that really still happens down there.
I was going to say, I'm sure that's happened many a time. I just watched a show last night on Netflix called Ridley Road, and it's about 1960s fascist London. And I was born in the 1960s, and my mother came from the countryside and went to London on her own, kind of like the protagonist, nothing to do with the fascism thing, but she just went to London to make her, fame and fortune. And I just thought, wow, did this really happen? Like all this, Nazi National Front, all that stuff. And basically it's there, it's in Europe, it's here. And what I find so upsetting is I feel like only in the last few years has it really come out again. Do you feel as a writer that you want to sort of, help, how do you feel as a writer you can help that situation?
It's frustrating because, to be honest with you, I'm not sure that I can make a difference, that I have enough of a footprint, enough of a academic grounding. I've just experienced it and I've seen it, and it makes me so mad that at least I can do is describe it anecdotally and let people see it and say, I had no idea that went on down. And this is the land, the book is set in the land of the DuPonts and of the very rich people who own racehorses. Yeah. And so there are better spokespeople for the racial issue than I am, but I wanted to say that. And the way that I put an edge on that was not to have it be benign white Anglo oppression with African Americans. The protagonist of the book is a Australian Aboriginal indigenous person. Right. And he was raised initially at the notorious Moore River native settlement in Western Australia, which was basically a holding pen for mixed race Aboriginal children. And so putting an Aboriginal person into Northern Maryland really created sort of an interesting twist that I had a lot of fun with.
Did you spend time in Australia then?
Yes, I've been to Australia quite a few times.
So you sort of saw that firsthand, as it were, the Aborigine thing.
Well, I saw firsthand the fact that all Aboriginals are discriminated against constantly at all times and in all ways in Australia. They have legislated better rights for them. There is some progress there, but basically it is still utterly a have-not culture. Yep. And my wife and I did a lot of consulting, mainly in Sydney and Brisbane. So we were in the big cities, so you just didn't see as many of the Indigenous peoples. But every time you did, you saw this very pervasive discrimination and contempt. And it gets under your skin.
Now, you've already written a second book. Is that part of a series or is that a standalone?
Well, since I killed the protagonist in the first few pages of this one, my options were limited. Right. No, the second book is...
What's it called?
It's called Old Dogs, New Tricks.
Okay.
And it is the story of a world-renowned architect who was forced into retirement at the age of 70, solely because he's 70. And he's over the hill, and the phone isn't ringing anymore. And he has no way of enjoying the challenges that he did before. So he retires, and he retires to a bucolic lake in middle Wisconsin, and almost immediately is simply bored to death. Mm-hmm. And he can't stand retirement, and he can't stand not being a visible figure in his field. So he turns to a life of crime.
Oh, interesting.
So this is a retired old guy who becomes a fence of stolen property.
That is a great premise. That is a very clever and great premise.
Well, and again, in my background early on as a prosecutor, I dealt with a lot of gangs who stole stuff and who fenced stuff. Some very notorious gangs around here in the Westchester and Chester County area. So I know a lot about fencing, and I know a lot about laundering money. And I figured, what am I going to do with this? So I stuck it into a book.
Fantastic. How much, you talk about having a mental photo album, which it's a great way of describing what a writer has. How much would you say of your writing is, made up, like you say, and how much is really based on scenes, people, real life experiences? In a percentage, just give me a percentage. I'm just curious. I think I have my own percentage myself.
Basically, 100% of it is a distortion of something I've already seen or read.
Okay.
So I start with a snapshot and I say, what can I do with this? Where can I take it? For example, in this book, there is a canal that connects Upper Chesapeake Bay with the Delaware River. And I thought, what would happen if a whale got into that canal? Well, that's happened in real life, In the 1980s, a whale went into San Francisco Bay and got stuck there. Right. And they had to lure him out with sound waves. So I've got a model somewhere that I can remodel and twist, and I can create distortions of, and it's just a lot of fun.
I have to just mention something that's inspiration for my third book, Leningrad Deception. And I discovered that Ronald Reagan had this thing called the Deception Committee. And it was a way of sort of putting down the Soviet Union, or making them stumble, making them not succeed. And there were submarines that were sent to Sweden and it sort of disguised as Soviets. I mean, it's just disguise of Soviet submarines. I'll finish the sentence. But anyway, I take your point that sometimes you get these facts, you get these extraordinary events that maybe we didn't hear about, and then, as I agree with you can run with them till kingdom come.
Richard, there's this little voice ticking on, always at the back of my head, saying, "Can you make this believable? Can you make people swallow this? Can you make people swallow the idea that an Aboriginal accountant ends up running an estate in Chesapeake City, Maryland?" So there's a challenge there to say, when you begin twisting, does it simply become absurd? Or can you make it so that it's coherent?
I find that nowadays that so much, like given this Ukraine war, so many people never thought that would happen. I feel like that gives me artistic license to go even further and be even more mind-bending than I would, because basically it seems to me nowadays anything can happen.
That's right.
In the last couple of minutes, it's such hard work doing this novel business. I know you said in one of the the research I did that, this wasn't your biggest achievement because you've done a lot of sort of real world problems. You've done a lot of things with that. But in terms of writing, it's very hard. It takes so much time. Why do you do it, Doug? And why do you think other people should write?
The first is easier than the second. First of all, I write because I'm verbose, and I have a flair, and I have a big vocabulary, and I enjoy doing something with it. And I also, I might add, enjoy the physical act of typing. So the mechanisms of writing are inherently fun for me.
You never handwrite?
Never handwrite.
So you like, that's fascinating. When you say you enjoy the physical act, what do you mean? Like seeing the words on a computer screen? Yeah. Would it be the same if it was a typewriter?
I have never used a typewriter, but I'll tell you how something will happen. About 4:30 in the morning, I'll wake up and a picture will come to mind. Boom. And I say, well, what if I took that and what if I did this? So very frequently I will get up and I'll go down and type enough notes on it so I can recapture what was in the dream or something like this. So for me, it's a very visually driven thing. And one thing often leads to another. And, a lot of writers talk about having an observing ego, that, they're sort of sitting in the room and so the muse comes in and sits down and sort of guides things. Yep. That's very much the way it is for me. I'm sometimes quite surprised at what comes out.
Right. And then do you remember the second part of the question?
Yes.
I'll remind you if you didn't.
What about other people?
Yeah.
And it depends on what you're going to get out of it. If you are trying to express a message, it's one thing. If you are a very adept, if you're an evocative thinker, if you're emotionally astute, you write poetry. So a lot of how you go about it depends on what you want to get out of it. The stuff I read of other debut novels suggests a lot of it's very derivative, and they want to be the next Tom Clancy or they want to be the next so-and-so. But I think a person should have they should be able to answer the question, why are you writing, other than just killing time or trying to work out your retirement.
What are the names of your dogs, by the way?
We have a Scottish Terrier named Kira, which means raven tresses in Gaelic. And then we have an Eskimo Spitz, an American Eskimo, a snow white dog whose name is Taj. And we just have acquired a Cairn Terrier puppy whose name is Puka. And in Hindi, Puka means the real thing or the optimum.
Do they sit there while you're writing?
Yes.
They do?
Yes, absolutely. Particularly Taj has a daily regime. After breakfast, we go out, and then I go to my word processor, and either Taj chooses Pam or me and insists that we sit down and work. Exactly at 4:20, she will lift Pam's hand off the keyboard, and it is time for us to take the dogs out to the dog park. And so, a lot of our discipline comes from our dogs.
I love it. That's one of my sort of if money were no object, I have a couple of golden retrievers, and they would be, I would, involve my writing because I would have nothing else to do because I wouldn't need to earn any more money. And I would write, but I would keep writing and I would have a couple of golden retrievers. Doug, thank you. Thank
Richard,
you so much.
This has been a great pleasure. Thank you for inviting me in.
My pleasure, and I hope you'll come again back for the next novel.
Anytime.
Thank you.
Is tomorrow too soon?
Anyway, that was Doug's first visit to Author Hour. I'm sure there will be more. You can find out more about Doug's books on Amazon. And remind me again your website,
DouglasRichardsonNovelist.com.
www.douglasrichardsonnovelist.com. And finally, if you didn't know, this year is Queen Elizabeth II's Platinum Jubilee celebration, which means the Queen has been on the royal throne for 70 years. So check out this non-fiction royal memoir of my great Aunt Flo, Florence Bramford, who served in the British royal household for 30 years under 2 Queen Elizabeths. The book is called From Cottage to Palace. I'm working on the audiobook right now, and it's available on Amazon. Cheerio. Thank you again, Doug. See you next time.
Thank you, Richard.